Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Politicians sometimes have to make decisions where there's no option that looks good, morally speaking. They may have to get their hands dirty, acting in a way that looks immoral, sometimes powerfully so, in order to avoid some greater evil. This is called the problem of dirty hands, and it's long been of interest to philosophers. However, most of the philosophical work about dirty hands has been focused on the person whose hands are dirty. Have they acted wrongly? Are they blameworthy? How should we respond to them? Christina Nick, a philosopher based at the Idea Centre, is more interested in the victims of dirty-handed politicians. These victims may have been subjected to quite profound harms as a result of the actions of politicians who were trying to avoid some even worse harm. What does it look like to treat these victims justly? Specifically, are they owed reparations? And if so, what form should these reparations take? And should they be made by, or on behalf of, the politicians who made the decision? Welcome to the podcast, Christina.
Thanks for having me.
And we're here to talk about the question of whether politicians owe reparations for dirty hands. In your paper that you've written on this topic, you start by introducing an example, a real historical example, which is the Claudie massacre. Is that right?
Yeah, the Claudie bombing, yeah.
So could you just tell me what happened in that example?
Yeah, sure. So the Claudie bombing occurred within the wider context of the Northern Ireland conflict. And so basically on the 31st of July 1972, 3 car bombs exploded in a rural village called Claudie. And overall, 9 people were killed. 3 of those were children, and over 30 people were injured. And so one of the survivors described it, and I quote here, "There was black smoke, people screaming, dust, slate stones and glass, everything flying. A large piece of a car landed at my feet. It was a trap. No matter what direction you went in, there was a bomb." So it was pretty horrifying scenes. And at the time, no one actually took responsibility for the attacks. And also at the time, no one was actually charged with planting the bombs. And all of this happened in the sort of wider conflict in 1972, which was one of the most violent years to date in the broader Northern Ireland conflict. So the case lay dormant for a very long time until in 2010, the police ombudsman for Northern Ireland brought out a report. And this report basically claimed that the then Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, William Whitelaw, a Cardinal, William Conway from the Roman Catholic Church, and a Royal Ulster Constabulary Chief Constable called Sir Graham Chillington, all together conspired to basically keep under wraps who they thought was responsible for the attack. And they basically, despite several police reports that alleged the involvement of a particular person, they sort of decided that this person should never be brought in. And the person in question was a Catholic priest called James Chesney, who was also known to be quite a high-ranking member of the local IRA. And so instead of bringing him for questioning, the 3 high-ranking officials from police, government and church decided basically behind closed doors that it would be better for Chesney to be silently transferred out of Northern Ireland into the Republic of Ireland. And that's what happened. And then Chesney spent the rest of his life until his death in 1980 in various parishes in the Republic of Ireland.
Right. So why did they decide that they shouldn't prosecute that person?
So basically, the idea was that they were, and this is what the police ombudsman report basically says, The police ombudsman report describes the decision as a type of moral conflict that they were faced with. So on the one hand, they obviously had the moral importance of bringing a potential murderer to justice. But on the other hand was also the worry that if it was to come out that a Catholic priest was involved in the murder of so many people, that would further aggravate the already really violent conflict, and that is something that they wanted to, obviously wanted to avoid. Now, this is not to say that this is actually what the reasoning was that was happening at the time. We obviously don't know, right, what exactly was happening in these conversations behind closed doors. But if we follow what the police ombudsman report says, then that is one sort of way of understanding the really difficult situation or choice that they were faced with.
Yeah, and it's at least plausible that that was the basis they made that decision on, right? That they were kind of weighing up justice in this particular case against the possibility of further incidents like this happening as a result of their actions kind of inflaming the situation. And that they made a kind of, they weighed up those two options and decided to go for what they thought was the least bad option, right? And this is what philosophers sometimes call a dirty hands type case, right? So this is something philosophers are interested in quite a bit, right? These kinds of cases where people are faced with a decision, they make what they think is the best decision in the circumstances that they're presented with, but the action that they end up taking still looks like it's, well, you can describe it in many ways, but certainly morally problematic, right? To conspire to cover up the real perpetrator of a crime.
Yeah, exactly. So the problem of dirty hands is something that I'm really interested in. And basically the idea is that just like what the police ombudsman report describes in a dirty hand scenario, you are faced with two sort of morally important things that you both want to achieve, but you cannot do both. You have to choose. You have to do one or the other. And that inevitably means that you will have to forgo something that's of really like important moral value. And that is then what causes this conflict. And so sometimes this has been described as facing impossible odds or impossible moral requirements. And it's those sorts of choices that I'm really interested in and that I think that the Claudie bombing sort of shows. And I think what's interesting about dirty hands theorizing is that a lot of moral philosophy would say, oh, well, you chose the right thing to do, the overall better option, right? And so you've done the right thing, full stop, we're done now. But what dirty hands theorists basically say is that just because you chose the better thing that you could do in the circumstances doesn't mean that it sort of makes up for the fact that you also committed something that is morally wrong at the same time. And it's this sort of complexity that dirty hands theory wants us to take more seriously. And the idea is that when you basically are faced with these impossible moral requirements, then you get your hands dirty by doing what you ought to be doing, or by doing what the right thing to do is. And that's the sort of paradoxical nature of dirty hands.
Yeah, and just to kind of bring home, why that's such a problem in this particular case, it's not just that kind of justice wasn't done in the abstract, right? But there are specific people who it looks like were harmed as a result of the decisions that were made. Right?
Yeah, so if we look at what happened in the aftermath of the report being published. So the then Secretary of State for Northern Ireland in 2010 basically issued an official apology, saying we're very sorry that we didn't investigate properly, that that this decision was made to not bring a potential murderer to justice.
Yeah.
They apologized for that.
Apologized to the families of the victims.
Yes, yeah. And but the survivors and the families of the victims, they demand more. They wanted, a thorough investigation. They wanted for someone to actually be held accountable for what happened. And those demands were just denied. In the end, the victims and families of the victims, they decided to take legal action. And after quite a lengthy legal battle, they did receive compensation from the police and government. But the compensation took the form of a confidential settlement. So we don't actually know what the number was that they settled for in the end. And very importantly, it did not come along with an admission of liability. So even though they received a settlement, it was very purposefully saying, but we don't actually admit any legal liability for what happened. So this was from police and government. Obviously, the church was also involved. And there is a case still ongoing against the Roman Catholic Diocese of Derry, but we don't have, at the moment, a ruling on that yet. But all of this just doesn't quite seem enough that the victims would have to go through such sort of like lengthy legal measures to get a form of accountability for what happened. And in the words of the victims, they have said that, and I quote here, they have been continually failed by those who they had placed their trust to serve this justice in. And the pain and trauma are still unbelievably deep. And this is sort of what motivated me to pick this particular case study, because I think in the Dirty Hands literature so far, a lot of focus has been put on figuring out what should happen with the person who dirties their hands afterwards. Yeah. What sort of emotions should they feel, right? How should they process the choice that they have made? And in the case of democratic politicians, it's also, what does that mean for democracy, right? When we're living in a system where we want to hold accountable those that we've elected, that act for us in our name, should politicians then publicize their dirty hands to us after the fact? Should we punish them? If so, on what grounds? So a lot of sort of ink has been spilled on what happens to the dirty-handed politician or official. But very little has been said on, well, what happens to the victims? What happens to those that have been left worse off as a result? Those for whom in the quote, in the words of the survivors, the pain and trauma are still unbelievably deep, right? What do we have to say about that? And that's sort of the motivation for my research at the moment.
Yeah, so it's a question about what those people are entitled to,
yes.
Right? Because even in that situation where, well, in the kind of hypothetical version of the situation where the people making the decision made a good faith decision, made what they thought was the right decision. And even if, all told they did make the right decision, there's still been a breach of trust, which is something important that's been neglected, and people have been actually harmed as a result of that. So the question you're interested in is, are those people entitled to reparations? But I suppose specifically reparations from the people who made the decision, because there could be reparations from the state or whatever. Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, in as much as it depends. In as much as we think that they were acting within their official sort of role and within their capacity as a representative of the state, we might think that sort of a state sort of level reparation could be appropriate, especially because in this case, all the people that made the decision are actually dead. So at this point, it would very much be the organization that sort of has endured over time, them making reparations on behalf of their representatives that kind of took that action.
Okay. But it's important that it's at least on behalf of the people who took the action. So it's not just, do these people deserve something for the suffering they felt? It's, do they deserve suffering? It's, do they deserve something from the person or organization or institution that caused that suffering?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, good. And so in thinking about how to respond to this problem, seems like a really tricky problem. One of the ideas that you introduce is this idea of the harness of necessity. So could you tell me what that is, please?
Yeah, so basically, I think when we think about sort of historic injustices like this and how to compensate for them, we naturally think about, making reparations. But it's not really that straightforward to kind of understand how reparations or talk of reparations applies in dirty hands cases. And one of these issues, as you say, is because of something that I call the harness of necessity worry. So the harness of necessity is a coin that was introduced by philosopher Bernard Williams. And basically the idea of it is that sometimes external sort of circumstances beyond our control put us into a position in which we have to make a choice between two evils, right? We're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. It's those types of situations. And the harness of necessity, the idea is that we can't be said to then be acting voluntarily, because we are sort of forced in the choice that we are making. Yeah. And so I guess the problem is that while, of course, we could voluntarily choose to do the better or the worst option, right? We could choose the bigger evil or the greater or the lesser evil. But what we are not voluntarily choosing is the fact that even if we choose to do the lesser evil, it still remains an evil.
Yes.
So that's the sort of problem. But then if we are not acting voluntarily, then how can we be blamed for what we are doing? And if what we're doing isn't blameworthy, how can we owe reparations? How can I have a responsibility to make up for something if I wasn't blameworthy for the problem in the first place?
Yeah, good question. So how might we respond to that question? What can we say in response to that?
Well, I think I've got three responses. Now, I'm not saying that any of these are like the be-all, end-all, right? And some of these might be more convincing to people than others, and they probably get sort of more difficult to get your head around or to get on board with as we go on, right? But the first response could simply be that, well, I can accept that the dirty-handed official is not morally blameworthy for what they have done, right? Let's just accept that. And we can even say that they do not, as a result, owe reparations. But we can still say that a good moral person would still want to make reparations anyway. And this is because I think we can all accept that a good moral person would still feel a sort of moral taint that attaches to them, a sort of moral remainder. And that's quite a crucial kind of part of dirty hands theory, the idea that the fact that you've done something wrong, sort of, it sticks with you. Yes. And the idea is that a good moral person would try to make reparations to sort of distance themselves from that wrongdoing, to try and get rid of this moral taint that attaches to them, to the sort of, even if they feel like shame or they might be stigmatized by other people, even if that is not rational, right? They still want to do something to get rid of that. And this is why they would want to make reparations. It would give them sort of an opportunity to reaffirm that they still think the value that they violated is important. It sort of redeems them both in their own eyes and the eyes of others. And so we might say that, okay, they're not responsible, they're not blameworthy, they don't owe reparations, but a good person would make reparations anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because, yes, I can see that, and I can absolutely see that the way in which a sort of somebody who had empathy for the victims and kind of was a responsible person and sort of saw their role in what happened as important would want to make reparations. But in a way, if they're genuinely not blameworthy, our response to that might be, but it's not your fault. You know, it's good that you want to do that, but you shouldn't be required to. I'm thinking about like examples like, you know, train drivers, when somebody jumps in front of a train or something, like, and I imagine train drivers must feel absolutely terrible about that. And they might want to kind of apologize to the family of the person or whatever. But our response to that is to say, no, it really isn't your fault, right? So if somebody genuinely isn't blameworthy, it seems like even if them being a good person would make them want to give reparations, we might still say, but you shouldn't.
Yeah, and I think this response just doesn't it doesn't quite get us where we want to be in response to this harness of necessity worry, because it can't really say, in the kind of case of the Claudie bombing, it can't really tell us why we think that there's something missing and that there's something wrong in the victims having to go through lengthy legal battles in order to get sort of any acknowledgement of the harm that was done to them. So I don't think that this response is quite sufficient. And so I think there's a second way in which we can maybe do this. So the second response, we would still accept that the dirty-handed official is not morally blameworthy. We would still say, okay, harness of necessity, that's all fine. But we would say that you can have a moral obligation to make reparations for the damages that you have caused, even if you were not blameworthy for causing them. So this idea relies on something that has been called by legal philosopher Tony Honoré outcome responsibility. So he defines outcome responsibility as attributing consequences to a person independent of whether they were at fault or whether they deserve it. So he gives a really useful example about a football player. So imagine that I take, now I'm not a good football player. So most likely scenario is I take a really bad shot at the goal. But luckily for me, there's like a gust of wind that carries the ball into the goal, right? I deserve no praise for this whatsoever, but I still get the goal attributed to me at the end of the game, right? Similarly, if I take a really good shot at the goal, I don't know, for once, I actually got it right. But there's a gust of wind and the ball actually doesn't hit the net. Then I might be praiseworthy for having, finally gotten the technique right or something. Yeah. But I wouldn't get the goal attributed at the end. So there's something quite important about just what we cause and what we don't cause, independent of whether we are blameworthy or praiseworthy for it. And so we might want to say then that I can owe reparations in virtue of being outcome responsible rather than being fully morally responsible for what I've done. And a helpful example in the case of reparations that philosopher David Miller gives us is he asks us to imagine that I'm walking on the pavement. And I give, I'm really careful not to knock into people, but there's an unfortunate accident and I stumble and I knock someone else over. And so David Miller says that everyone around, right, clearly has some obligation to, make sure everyone is okay, to help people up, so on and so forth. But in the first place, we think it's down to me to go, hey, I'm really sorry, help that person up, to apologize, to check that they're okay. If I've managed to knock them over, now their coffee is spilled all over the pavement, to offer them to buy them another coffee or something, right? In the first place, we think that's down to me, even though I stumbled by accident and even though it really wasn't my fault. And so that example is supposed to show us that maybe we have responsibilities to make up for what we cause, even if it wasn't our fault. Yeah,
that's interesting. Is that example really that different from the first point, though? I mean, it still feels a bit to me like what's happening there is a good person recognizes that they played some role in the chain of causation or whatever that caused that person to be hurt, and it's a good thing for them to offer to make it up to them in some way. But still, the person who was hurt, their proper response is to say it wasn't your fault, right? And so it's maybe not that they owe something so much as that, again, it's a good thing for them to want to do that.
I think it does go a bit beyond that. So I think it's sort of the idea of outcome responsibility maybe slightly challenges the way in which we usually think about moral responsibility. So Bernard Williams, who I mentioned, who kind of came up with this idea of the harness of necessity, he actually thinks that there's a particular force that sort of applies to us in our lives, that comes simply from the things that we cause. It's not just from what we are responsible for, like morally speaking, but just from what we are responsible for, causally speaking. And he says, this is a quote, "Those who have been hurt need a response. Simply what has happened to them may give them a right to seek it. And where can they look more appropriately than to you, the cause?" So the idea is that it's not just that it's sort of charity or supererogatory that you give reparations to them. It's actually, no, you do owe it, and you owe it simply in virtue of having caused it. So it does try and get a step further. But I can see that it's still not quite as satisfying, right? You might still think that, no, but the three officials in the case of the Claudia bombing, right, they actively made that decision, right? They sat behind closed doors, they deliberated, and they said, this is what we were going to do, knowing full well what the consequences were. So you might think, this is still not quite getting us to where we want to be.
Yes, good. So it doesn't look quite like it's an analogous case. It's not just that they were, involved in what caused it to happen. It was a result of a decision that they made. Good. So is there another response that we might make to the harness of necessity problem?
Yeah, so this is sort of where the third response kind of comes in. The third response would be like, no, we're actually rejecting the harness of necessity. And you know what? They were morally responsible, and that's why they owe reparations. But in order to make that move, we have to rethink how we usually conceive what it means to act voluntarily. So I think most of the time we think that what it means to act voluntarily is that I have an acceptable alternative option available to me, right? So if I hold a gun to your head and tell you, give me your money, and then you give me the money, that usually means that you don't act voluntarily because, well, there was no acceptable alternative option available to you. So the problem in Dirty Hands cases is there is no acceptable alternative because the only alternative is an even greater evil. So by definition, it would therefore seem that when you're making a choice in a Dirty Hands scenario, you're acting involuntarily. Now, someone who's argued against this sort of understanding of voluntariness is philosopher Alan Wertheimer. And he asks us to imagine a medical patient who has a potentially fatal disease. And they have basically two options. Either they just accept their fate and die, or they consent to a really invasive but potentially life-saving procedure. Now, death would clearly count as an unacceptable option. Right? So if we accept our standard understanding of voluntariness, that means that they can't actually voluntarily say, oh, I accept this life-saving but really invasive and problematic and potentially really dangerous procedure because there was no alternative option available. But if they can't say that voluntarily, that means they can't consent. And that then ends us up in a really sort of difficult situation. Because if we accept the standard view of voluntariness, then in this medical case, that would undermine our ability to give valid consent. And that would leave us with the option to say that either the doctor should not provide the life-saving treatment because the patient can't consent to it, or that it is acceptable to provide the life-saving but really invasive and dangerous procedure without patient consent. So either we end up with holding life-saving surgery, or we undermine patient autonomy by overriding like the fundamental importance of consent. So something's sort of gone awry here, right?
It also just seems like sorry to interrupt, it just seems like the wrong description of that case to say that patient doesn't act voluntarily. If that's the choice, they might think, no, I'm voluntarily saying, please treat me, please give me this treatment, right? So to say they're not doing it voluntarily just seems wrong somehow.
Exactly. So it seems that we can act voluntarily and make voluntary decisions even when the only other option available to us is just a fundamentally bad and unacceptable option. And Wertheimer thinks that he then kind of provides an account of how we might make sense of this alternative understanding of voluntariness. And he thinks basically that sometimes we need to think about whether it is morally important that in that situation a person can act voluntarily. And there are good reasons, like in the medical case, where we want to make sure that patients can act autonomously and that they can receive the treatment that they need. There are good moral reasons to say what they're doing is voluntary, even if the only option available to them is like problematic, basically. There are good reasons that we want politicians and public officials to be able to act voluntarily in such cases, because they need to give binding orders to those that then enact those decisions. And if those kind of lower down the food chain were, if they had good reasons to think that maybe the choice wasn't voluntary and that, you know, there was like force involved or pressure or duress, then they might have reasons to not obey or not to enact the decision. And that would be really problematic, right? We want those in political leadership positions to be able to be efficient and to give orders that are then going to be obeyed. And so that's why maybe we think that in those cases, dirty-handed officials acted voluntarily, even if they didn't have an acceptable alternative available to them. And therefore, they're morally blameworthy, and therefore they can owe reparations.
Great. So that's one possible, well, three possible responses.
Yeah,
that you gave
there's a lot of them.
that you gave to the harness of necessity problem. But then you introduce another problem, right, which is the praiseworthiness problem. So what's that?
Yeah, so let's say, okay, they've acted voluntarily, or even if they haven't acted voluntarily, maybe they're still outcome responsible. Either way, we think they can owe reparations. The problem is that the dirty-handed official chose the lesser evil when doing so was exceedingly difficult. They were in a really tight spot. And surely when someone makes the best call possible in a really difficult situation, what we would usually want to do is we want to praise them. We want to say, well done for making that really tough choice. But how can making reparations square with also praising someone for what they have done? There just seems to be, again, a bit of a mismatch or a tension between saying you have to make up for the bad that has happened to other people as a result of what you've done. But well done you. that it doesn't quite match.
Seems weird, yeah. Okay. So how do we respond to that problem?
I've got two responses this time, not three. And I think the first one might go, you know what? Yes, they are praiseworthy, but our concern for the victims should trump our expression of that praiseworthiness. And now you might say, well, why should the victims' needs trump the needs of politicians and public officials, right? Why do we give one sort of priority over the other? And I would say that, politicians, public officials, they've taken on a position that by its very nature comes with the promise of power and glory and lots of perks that come with, being in such leadership positions. But also, conversely, they, by their very nature, come with the burdens and risks that are associated with gaining power and the like. And I think when you take on that position, you sort of just have to accept, next to the perks, also the risks. And the risks is that you're going to face a situation like that, and no one's going to tell you, good job. Right? Everyone's going to focus on the bad that you have done. And that's just part of what it is to be in politics. So Michael Walzer gives the sort of slightly analogous example of Arthur Harris, who was the leader of the Royal Air Force Bomber Command during World War II, who obviously were responsible for the carpet bombings that are very infamous. And there's a lot of debate around the the ethics of those carpet bombings.
Yeah.
Michael Walzer introduces the sort of analogous case of Arthur Harris, who was the lead of the Royal Air Force Bomber Command during World War II, who were obviously responsible for the carpet bombings, which there has been a lot of debate around the ethics of that practice. And I think, so what Walzer then says is that we should acknowledge that, it took courage and endurance to perform these actions, but that it was not possible to take pride in what they had done. So the idea is that we can acknowledge that it was difficult and it was hard and it was tough, but that we shouldn't say you're praiseworthy for doing that simply because of the real kind of harm that has caused to so many people. And that might be one of the responses. And the second response kind of goes a bit deeper, I think. I think that demanding reparations from public officials makes them sort of aware that the constraint that they violated was non-negotiable, in the words of philosopher Lisa Tessman. And a moral demand, according to her, is non-negotiable when intuitively even the thought of just violating it would be completely unthinkable to us. And why is it important that it remains sort of unthinkable for politicians to do this? It's because politicians are not just going to face these types of situations once, right? Political life is sort of filled with these kinds of really difficult situations. Now, there might not always be, the life and deaths of like thousands of people that are at stake, but, to various degrees, these are going to crop up a lot throughout a politician's career. And so I think the more you find yourself in these situations, the easier it is to become accustomed to the dirt. Right? It becomes easier. Once you've violated a moral constraint, it becomes easier the next time to do it again and then again until you don't really see the lines anymore, until they've become blurred.
It's really interesting that, isn't it? Because, of course, there is a sense in which those things can't be unthinkable to politicians who find themselves in those situations. Like, they do have to think about that and actually do it as well. And there's a sense in which it's negotiable because they're kind of, they are weighing it against other considerations that are equally or more important and end up taking that option. So it's what's being recommended there, that politicians in a way kind of continue to think about these things as unthinkable while at the same time thinking them.
Yes, sort of. That's another. It's very well put in that way. It's another part of the sort of paradoxical nature of Dirty Hands. And Michael Walzer puts this, that we want a very particular kind of person to be our politician. We want someone that has scruples, right? And so he says, quote, "Because he has scruples of this sort, we know him to be a good man. It's important to stress that we don't want just anyone to make the deal. We want him to make it precisely because he has scruples about it. We know he is doing right when he makes the deal because he knows he is doing wrong." It's this paradoxical sort of mindset that is the hallmark of a good politician, according to Dirty Hands theory. And the idea is that reparations can help with this, because reparations can sort of bring home to the politician that this remains unthinkable. Even though you did think it, it remains unthinkable, and it does so for good reasons, and you have to pay the price for having thought what should have been unthinkable. And actually ensuring that dirty-handed politicians retain the sort of reluctance to engage in morally unthinkable actions, that then ensures the very prerequisites that are necessary for them to act in a praiseworthy manner the next time around, right? So even though, and this is sort of the roundabout way in which I got around the praiseworthiness worry, is that even though reparations are sort of incompatible with saying, but also well done, what reparations can do is they can ensure that in future the politician can act in a way that would in principle be praiseworthy, even though we maybe think that we shouldn't be expressing that too much out of concern for the victims and the harm that was done.
Yes, I see that. Great. Okay. So 2 problems, 5 potential responses to those 2 problems. In the end, do you think dirty-handed politicians do owe reparations to people who are harmed as a result of their decisions?
I think the short answer is yes. Yeah, I do think so. As I said briefly earlier, I don't think any of my responses are supposed to be like, oh, this is the knockdown argument. That's not really it. And I think some of those responses, as we have discussed, are more convincing or sort of go deeper than some of the others. But what they do show us is that there are some credible ways of responding to worries that people might have about making reparations after getting your hands dirty. And I think what it does is hopefully give those working in this area good reasons to take a more victim-centered approach going forward, and to spend a bit more time thinking not just what should happen to the person who gets their hands dirty, but also to the people that are harmed as a result.
Great. Well, Christina Nick, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.